The Needles must be one of the most famous natural landmarks around Britain's coastline. These jagged lumps of chalk and the notorious tides around here combine to make this area of sea treacherous to the unwary mariner. It was here that the first recorded dive to salvage the cargo from a shipwreck was attempted, and it has a unique royal connection. The wreck was the Campan. The salvage attempt was commissioned by King Charles I, for whom the Isle of Wight was soon to become his prison. Of all the Isle of Wight's many connections with the Crown, its links with Charles I are perhaps the most poignant, because it was here at Carisbrooke Castle that he was imprisoned by Parliament. Captured in Scotland in 1647 at the conclusion of the Civil War, Charles was a problem for his captors. Initially held at Hampton Court, he escaped in fear of his life, fled to the Isle of Wight, and sought the protection of Colonel Hammond, the governor of the island and brother of the King's chaplain. However, Hammond was also related to Cromwell by marriage, and Carisbrooke became a gilded cage for the King. To begin with, the King had the freedom to ride around the island. He visited the Needles and was entertained at various manor houses. All might have been well except for two events. First of all, he tried to escape. Charles's servant, Henry Firebrace, smuggled a rope into the King's chamber. Their plan was simple. Charles would climb out of the window and lower himself to the ground.
At the appointed time, he went out into the courtyard, gave the King his signal, which was, I think, stones thrown up to the window, and the King opened his window and tied his rope and started climbing out, but he got stuck between his breast and his shoulders. And Firebrace says that while he's stuck, he heard him groan and couldn't come to help him, nothing he could do about it. And it seems as though he'd had a sort of premonition almost that this was going to happen, because he'd actually suggested to the King that it would be a good idea to get the bar out the window first. And the King had said no. He said, I've tried putting my head through the window and that fits through, and where the head will pass, the body will follow. And of course he was wrong. So that attempt came to nothing.
Trying to escape might have been forgiven, but when news leaked out that the King had secretly negotiated and signed a treaty with the Scots to reignite the war against Parliament, he was no longer seen as a harmless guest, but as a dangerous prisoner. The Great Hall at the heart of the castle and the upper rooms became Charles I's prison between November 1647 and September 1648. It was here that he whiled away the long hours, writing justifications for his actions. Hammond did his best to make the King as comfortable as possible. He even constructed a bowling green in the Bailey. He spent a lot of time walking on the green. On one occasion, the King found the 9-year-old gunner's son marching behind him with a wooden sword. The King asked him what he was doing with such a terrible weapon, and the boy replied that he was going to defend the King with it from his enemies. The King was touched and gave the boy a ruby ring fastening his cravat to remember him by, and that ruby can still be seen in the museum.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We've got unrivaled access to the world's leading historians, with hundreds of documentaries featuring everything from Boudica to the British royal family. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Real Royalty fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use code REALROYALTY at checkout.
It was while he was on the island that Parliament made their last attempt to negotiate with the King, But it came to nothing, and he set off from Carisbrooke on his last journey to Westminster and eventual execution. The original Carisbrooke Castle was probably built about the time of William the Conqueror, but the name of the Isle of Wight dates from much earlier than that. It's thought that the actual nomenclature for the island stemmed from a Celtic word meaning separation from the mainland. The island was actually a separate feudal domain originally given to a William Fitz-Osbern. But by the 13th century, the Crown was so concerned about a possible invasion from France that the king put an end to private ownership of the isle. It was from then on that a captain and later governor of the isle was appointed, and Carisbrooke became the natural residence. Sir James Worsley of Appuldurcombe was made captain of the island by Henry VIII. He was also the first local man to hold the position.
Sir James Worsley was the same age as the king, and as a young lad had been his whipping boy. Now the law stated that it was a crime to offer physical violence to a prince of the blood. So to get round this, a boy of the same age was appointed so that there was someone around to take the punishment if the prince did anything wrong. Regrettably, the practice has long been abolished. Worsley's reward, albeit much later in life, was to be made captain of the Isle of Wight.
Soon after arriving on the island, he met and married the heiress Anne Lee. When her father died, James found himself the owner of Appuldurcombe estate and the richest man on the island. Appuldurcombe still exists, but you can still tell that it must have been a beautiful building in its day. It must have been stunning when Henry VIII came to visit. He was keen to hunt for game in the woods, in particular for partridge and pheasant. But legend has it that a local poacher virtually cleaned out the area of game just the week before, and the king was left empty-handed. Worsley was buried at God's Hill Church, where a memorial to him and his wife still stands. The church sits on top of one of the steepest hills on the island, and the story goes that it was named God's Hill after the builders found their bricks and building materials repeatedly moved up here from the village during the night by some unseen hand. In 1582, the title changed from captain to governor of the island. One of the most colourful soon followed, Sir Robert Holmes. Yarmouth was once the chief port, and it was here that Holmes entertained Charles II at his home, which is now called the George Hotel. He bought the governorship from Lord Culpeper and established himself in some splendour. Holmes had a love-hate relationship with King Charles. The king visited him on 3 occasions, with much drinking and philandering going on.
One of the prerequisites of Holmes's governorship was that he was entitled to keep 2/3 of the value of any ship and her cargo that he was able to capture in the waters off the isle, whether that belonged to an enemy of England or a supposed neutral. And so, for the next 20 years, from his house next to the sea in Yarmouth, he conducted a flourishing business which amounted, in a word, to piracy.
One of the French ships he captured contained a partly finished statue of Louis XIV, so he brought it back to Yarmouth and had his own head put on the king's body. It's now in the altar of the church that stands in the square. The George Inn, where Holmes lived, was extremely prosperous, and corporation meetings would be held here. At one such meeting in 1784, the guest of honour was Lieutenant Charles Cunningham Crook of HMS Expedition. A considerable amount of wine was consumed, and before staggering back to his ship, the lieutenant picked up a box of more bottles. When he opened it, he was mightily disappointed to find that the box was full of old papers, and in his disgust, he threw the whole lot out to sea. It was the next day, when no one could find the official town records, that the ghastly mistake was realised. But it was too late. The records were lost forever.
The story of the Isle of Wight has always been linked with the sea. The seas around the isle have all too often been linked with tragedy. For centuries, the locals lived officially by fishing and the maritime trade, unofficially by smuggling and salvaging shipwrecks.
As early as 1244, the Bishop of Winchester preached against the practice of smuggling, and the church was also responsible for the first lighthouse on the isle, St. Catherine's Hill, known locally as the Pepper Pot. It stands as a monument to Walter de Godderton, who believed that he could safely steal 53 casks of wine from the wreck of the ship of the Blessed Mary, which struck the rocks on the south of the island in 1313. Walter was caught and fined by the king. He was then ordered by the church to build an oratory chapel and alongside it a pharos, or lighthouse. Nothing was done to replace this obsolete building until 1836, when the Clarendon was wrecked.
The Clarendon was inward bound from the West Indies, and there were 23 people aboard, 10 passengers, 13 crew. And it had encountered horrendous weather all the way across the Atlantic, and encountered even worse weather when it actually got into the English Channel. The nail was in the coffin because he was driven in towards the shore. Thankfully, there were 3 survivors, and there's quite a story to that, because one of the daughters of the Captain Shaw, or Major Shaw, one of the passengers, the whole family were wiped out, but her body never came ashore, and it actually washed round and actually washed up at the base of the garden of her father's house at Southsea, which was very peculiar.
There are graves and monuments to the dead sailors in the churchyard in Chale and the pub next door. The Clarendon pub was named in honour of those that died, and the pub was enlarged from timber washed up from the wreck. Locals were so shocked by this tragedy that work started almost immediately on a new lighthouse at St. Catherine's Point. The Clarendon was by no means the first nor the last ship to have come to grief on this island, and the numerous lighthouses around the shores are a constant reminder of just how treacherous the waters are here. Perhaps the most dangerous point and most famous lighthouse is at the Needles. The Needles take their name from the chalk pillar that stood between the nearest and second stack. The first stack was connected to the island by a chalk arch until about 1815.
The lighthouse is a reminder of just how dangerous the waters are around here, and the number of ships that have floundered in the thick fog or the vicious storms that blast this exposed peninsula. It's impossible to estimate exactly how many ships have gone down, but hundreds have been recorded.
The first recorded was the Campden in 1627. She tried to navigate a path through the Needles, but failed. The following year, King Charles I backed a scheme from the Duke of Buckingham to undertake the first recorded salvage of an underwater wreck in British waters.
Due to the large number of ships which have met their watery graves around the Isle, it's perhaps not surprising that there are several stories of ghost ships seen sailing over and over again to their doom. The notorious Atherfield Ledge is one of the most haunted areas, but perhaps the most remarkable story occurred in Sandown Bay in March 1878 during a severe blizzard.
The Eurydice was under full sail with some 336 men and boys on board. Observers on shore remarked that the sails were too full for the wind. Meanwhile, in Windsor, a retired government official, Sir John McNeill, was having tea with the Bishop of Ripon when he suddenly jumped up and cried out, "Why don't they close the portholes and reef the topsail?" He cannot explain what happened, but he had seen a strong image of a ship in the channel with a huge black cloud above it. Next moment, the ship was engulfed in a sudden snowstorm, and within minutes the deck and rigging were covered in snow. The captain quickly realised that the ship had become top-heavy and ordered every man for himself, but it was too late. The Eurydice capsized and sank. Of the 336 men and boys on board, just 2 survived. When the blizzard cleared, there was only an empty horizon where once a graceful ship had been. Yet the story doesn't quite end there. The sister of a 24-year-old Marine, James Turner, who went down with the ship, claimed that her brother appeared at her bedroom door, water dripping from his wet clothing. Meanwhile, there have been many sightings of a 3-masted schooner around Dunno's Point, which disappears when approached, and which many believe is the Eurydice.
Stories of ghosts on the Isle of Wight are not just about shipwrecks, but also the other great unofficial livelihood, smuggling. This part of the coastline on the back of the Wight has numerous gullies or chines, which were particularly popular with the smugglers, for they were virtually impossible for the customs officers to patrol.
Smugglers were pretty ruthless. It was not always the forces of authority that were their victims. On dark, moonless nights, this lane is said to echo to the eerie screams and moans of one such victim. Buxom Betty was the daughter of a smuggler who fell in love with an excise officer and betrayed her comrades who were hiding their contraband at the nearby Blacksmith's Arms Inn. An ambush was carefully planned, which caught most of the smugglers, but not all. The 2 that escaped returned to find Betty, dragged her to this lane, and proceeded to kill her very slowly. Which is why it came to be known as Betty Haunt Lane.
Without doubt, the most famous association the Crown has with this part of the country is Osbourne House.
Well, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had 3 residences at the time of their marriage: Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle and Brighton Pavilion. What they really wanted was a home of their own. And it was in 1844 that the Prime Minister of the time, who was Robert Peel, introduced the Queen to Osbourne House and said it may be for sale. And so the Queen and Albert came down to the Isle of Wight and they fell in love with the house and the surroundings. And Queen Victoria and Prince Albert bought the house from a Lady Isabella Blatchford. The price was actually £28,000, but after a bit of negotiation, it came down to £26,000, and that was with 342 acres of ground.
Albert was very involved in the design, which is why he employed a builder and not an architect. The house is full of his ideas and love of technology. Prince Albert's bathroom has a bath with a hot water system that he designed. Albert was also very interested in photography, and there is a row of photos of the royal children here.
The house was never built to impress. It was a family home right from the very beginning. That's what Prince Albert and Queen Victoria wished. Somewhere where the children could come and they could be a total family. They could walk in the grounds, plenty of fresh air, riding, picking flowers, planting trees. Wonderful. The estate apartments were actually designed in an open plan, which was quite unusual for the day. And the billiard room leads off the drawing room. So after dinner, the gentlemen play billiards. The Queen perhaps would still be in the drawing room. But the gentlemen were not permitted to sit in the presence of the Queen. So there was a very cleverly devised bench seat built, so the gentlemen could actually perch there, and that was quite acceptable.
The royal couple and their young family spent many happy times here, and there are plenty of little reminders. Here in the Queen's sitting room are 2 desks side by side, where they used to sit beside each other to work. And throughout the house there are many of Victoria and Albert's paintings. In 1861, the Queen's life changed dramatically when first her mother and then her husband died. Albert had grown increasingly ill and eventually died in December from typhoid. The Queen was overwhelmed with grief and retired to Osbourne.
The Queen, of course, was devastated, and she arrived at Osbourne about 3 days after the death of Albert at Windsor Castle. And everyone was plunged into black. Even the women who worked on the estate, there was 52 of them, were actually given black material and 4 yards of black ribbon to have dresses made. And even the carriages, some of the carriages had rubber wheels, so not to disturb the Queen with any noise whatsoever.
In the dining room, the marriage of Princess Alice and Prince Louis of Hesse took place in July 1862. It was overshadowed, though, by the continued mourning for the death of the Prince Consort, and it's said that Queen Victoria sat in a window crying.
The Queen died here at Osbourne in January 1901, surrounded by her family. She lay in state in the dining room, and a few days later she began her final journey to London, taken across the Solent on the royal yacht Alberta. The Queen had left detailed instructions for her funeral, including forbidding black, so the streets of London were decorated with purple and white ribbons. Her body rests next to her husband in Frogmore, in Windsor. The Queen's bedroom is laid out at the time she died, with a picture of Albert above the bed. In fact, she had a portrait of him in every room of all her houses after his death. The parish church to Osbourne is Whippingham and contains a number of memories of Victoria and Albert's time on the Isle. The church was rebuilt to Prince Albert's design in 1860. Princess Beatrice, who was the youngest of Victoria and Albert's children, took over the role of Governor of the Isle in 1896. She now lies in this massive marble sarcophagus with her husband. Victoria and Albert left several marks on the Isle, although possibly the most poignant is a memorial to Charles I's daughter, Elizabeth, but that can be found in Newport's parish church. Following the execution of their father, the 14-year-old Elizabeth and her little brother Henry, Duke of Gloucester, remained in Parliament's hands. Fearing that the Royalists would use them as a rallying point, they were brought to Carisbrooke in August 1650. Although treated considerately, Elizabeth was a delicate child who had rickets. Just 2 months later, she was caught in a rain shower on the bowling green and was later found dead in her room from pneumonia. She was buried in St Thomas's, and her grave was subsequently forgotten. In 1793, workmen were digging to make a grave when they discovered a stone with the inscription E.S. However, when the new church was built, Queen Victoria considered that there should be something more fitting for her, and commissioned a leading Italian sculptor to make the present tomb. What makes the memorial so special is that it links the 2 monarchs most closely associated with the Isle of Wight, Queen Victoria and Charles I. It provides a lasting and poignant tribute to the special relationship between the Crown and this part of the country.
Traditionally, kings have been leaders both of people and of armies. Our island's history is littered with warrior kings like Arthur and Alfred, Edward I and Richard I. The last British king to lead his army into battle was George II in 1743. Since then, we've relied on professional generals.
One of the most famous and successful of the British Army's generals was Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington. This statue of the Duke on his charger Copenhagen was cast in celebration of his victory over Napoleon Bonaparte at Waterloo.
It weighs a staggering 40 tons and was moved from Hyde Park Corner to this site at Aldershot in 1885. It's rather appropriate because since the 1850s, Aldershot has become the accepted home of the British Army. How and why the army actually ended up here has nothing whatever to do with Wellington. In fact, it's got nothing whatever to do with any general. It was largely due to Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort.
Until 150 years ago, the area around here was known as Rushmore and was part of common land infested with highwaymen. Aldershot and Farnborough were mere hamlets and had been since Saxon times. The land belonged to Winchester Cathedral, apart from a brief period after the dissolution when it was taken by the Crown, but the soil was poor and sandy and of little use to farmers. After the disasters of the Crimean War, there was widespread criticism of the army, and in particular its generals. Prince Albert was especially concerned and was able to highlight one key area: the lack of staff training. Albert made an impact on the organisation of the forces, which still exists today. He assisted the foundation of a staff college at Sandhurst and the initiation of the first large-scale military exercise on Chatham Common. Seeing the precision and organisation of the army today, it's hard to believe that before 1856 there was no formal training for officers. They had no way of learning how to command all the elements of infantry, cavalry, artillery and the engineers, or even to be able to practice together. It was Albert's innovation to put that right.
The success of the first experiment on Chobham Common convinced the authorities of the need to purchase some land dedicated to military training. Rushmore was ideal. It was cheap, there was hardly anybody living here, and it was close to the major road and rail links.
On the arrival of the army, the area was completely transformed. And not only that, it was transformed within a very short space of time. The building of the camp required 3,000 labourers, and there was also the influx of troops. Initially, the troops who first came to Aldershot were accommodated in tents. They were returning from the Crimea in many cases. They had lots of war pay, and this meant that there was a huge influx of traders and money and soldiers, and the town, or what had been a very small village, was suddenly transformed into something like a Wild West town. Drink became a huge problem. The soldiers had returned from the Crimea. They had significant amounts of money on them, and all along the borders of the camp there were all sorts of beer houses, dancing saloons and so-called vile houses of the time. In 1862, a Miss Daniels visited Aldershot and she saw the depravity and drunkenness that existed in the town at that time, and she set up a soldiers' home to establish respectable leisure pursuits for the soldiers.
Within 10 years, the population of Aldershot had expanded from 800 to about 8,000. Beaumont Barracks were the first to be built, and this high wall was built around them to separate Aldershot from the burgeoning military town. Beaumont Barracks also housed the riding school, which is still in use today. Winston Churchill was posted to Aldershot after he graduated from Sandhurst and had an awful time with one of the riding instructors here, and complained about the uncomfortable uniforms and the way he was treated.
Like Churchill, there have been many public figures who started life as soldiers and experienced the plains and forests of Aldershot in all manner of weather. Many a general has learnt his trade at the Staff College nearby and tested his skills during exercises around here. Yet while Wellington is not numbered amongst them, he did live remarkably close to what became the home of the army.
Stratfield Saye was given to the Duke of Wellington as a gift from the nation after the Battle of Waterloo. He had been created the first Duke out of the general rejoicing that followed Napoleon Bonaparte's defeat and abdication. However, when Napoleon escaped from his exile in Elba at the end of February 1815 and triumphantly returned to Paris, the whole of Europe united in asking Wellington to save the day.
Stratfield Saye is full of reminders of the man who became known as the Iron Duke, and is occupied still by his direct descendant, the present Duke of Wellington.
He was the third son of Lord Mornington, Earl of Mornington, and he was considered rather the dunce of the family. His elder brothers were much cleverer, I think. And when he was quite young, his mother said, "I think Arthur's just food for powder," which is a polite way of saying, well, not a very polite way of saying that he did go to the army. And he went to Eton, actually, but he wasn't very successful, and then was sent to a military riding school at Angers in France, which was actually a very good preparation because he learnt to speak French very well, he learnt to ride well, and then after leaving that, he got a commission in the army and worked his way up. There's no doubt that Waterloo had a tremendous psychological effect on him. He said after the battle, the greatest misery after a battle lost is a battle won with the loss of so many friends and men. And he said also, I hope to God I fought my last battle. And the losses were appalling. There were 50,000 people left lying on the ground in 6 hours, and he did not fight another battle after Waterloo. And indeed, Waterloo, the importance of Waterloo, I think, is that it ensured peace in Europe for very nearly 50 years.
After 1815, he became a prominent diplomat and politician, eventually rising to be Prime Minister in 1828. He lasted a mere 2 years before being defeated. However, the Duke continued to play an important role as an elder statesman and advisor to both Prince Albert and, of course, Queen Victoria, from his home at Stratfield Saye.
The property dates from the time of James I and belonged to Sir William Pitt, who was controller of the King's household. Once it was acquired for Wellington, he wanted to build a palace to rival the Duke of Marlborough's Blenheim, but Parliament simply wasn't prepared to vote enough money for such a grand scheme.
These are the original grandiose plans, but they were never to become reality. Wellington was happy, but many saw Stratfield Saye as too small and poky for a man of such stature. Queen Victoria found it convenient, but complained of the heat. She was probably referring to the central heating. The central heating was thought to have been installed as the first Duke suffered from the cold, perhaps as a result of bouts of malaria that he contracted while in India. The library has hardly changed since his death, and it was one of his most used rooms.
He designed these library chairs, and you'll see with this business of propping up a book, that was called the Wellington Library Chair. He designed it. This was his favourite room.
There are 2 treasured locks of hair here, one from George Washington and one from Copenhagen, the Duke's favourite horse. The music room is dedicated to Copenhagen's memory. In 1807, Wellington took part in an expedition to capture the Danish fleet in Copenhagen under the leadership of Lord Grosvenor. The following year, Lord Grosvenor's mare gave birth to a foal that was named after the battle. Wellington bought that foal, and it became the horse that carried the Duke into the Battle of Waterloo.
Copenhagen retired here after Waterloo, and he lived here till 1836. The first Duke was very fond of him, and he said for bottom he had no equal, which meant he had tremendous stamina. And indeed he did, because he rode prodigious distances, and he was 18 hours in the saddle at Waterloo. 18 hours. And he died here in the paddock, and he was buried with military honours. And Mrs. Apostle, who was a housekeeper, loved Copenhagen, used to feed him with lumps of sugar and so on every day. And she put an acorn of a Turkey oak over his grave, and that acorn grew into a tree, and it's an enormous tree which is out there now.
The tricolor banners which hang in the gallery were presented by Napoleon to each department of France and were given up in tribute to the Duke on his entry into Paris after Waterloo.
Each successive Duke has presented a small tricolour to the sovereign in an annual ceremony held on or before Waterloo Day, the 18th of June, as a form of rent for the house and estate. As he grew older, the Duke became increasingly fond of Walmer Castle in Kent, which was his official residence as Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports. It was here in 1852 that he died at the age of 83. The state funeral was the greatest ever seen in England, and 1 million people watched the procession. The Prince Consort helped design a suitable triumphal car for the procession.
The ornate carriage took 18 days to build and was made of bronze cast from the melted down French cannon captured at Waterloo. It was designed to be drawn by 12 black dray horses, 3 abreast, but not everything went according to plan.
Unfortunately, the funeral carriage proved unwieldy and extremely heavy. On its way to St Paul's Cathedral, it got stuck in both the Mall and Ludgate Hill and had to be manhandled out of its difficulties by soldiers. On arrival at St Paul's, the device meant to enable the coffin to be unloaded did not work as planned. The great west door of the cathedral remained open for an hour and a half in icy November winds, much to the discomfort of the guests inside, many of whom put their hats on. During the latter part of his life, Wellington had been grooming Prince Albert to take over as the head of the army. Prince Albert was only 20 when he arrived in England from Germany to marry Queen Victoria. As the Queen's consort, he was given the rank of Field Marshal. Albert had no military experience, knew nothing about the complicated structure of the army, and, being German, was regarded by the general public with great suspicion and often met with hostility. But he took his military duties very seriously.
Albert showed great concern. Life was tough for a soldier. Low pay, cramped living conditions with no decent ventilation, sanitation or washing facilities. There was a high incidence of crime and disease. The regimental system was deeply corrupt by modern standards, and the public image of the army was very poor. It desperately needed modernising, yet no government seemed willing to risk its future on such issues.
Parliament was responsible for waging war and maintaining the army financially, but had no control over or interest in the discipline, orders and day-to-day running. Albert's interest brought the Queen much closer to the army in many different ways. During the Crimean War, the royal couple would regularly review the troops as they marched off to war. They visited the maimed in hospital, and the Queen awarded medals to the veterans personally. When Aldershot was established, a royal pavilion was built especially for Queen Victoria and her family, overlooking the training ground.
We were a major imperial power, and of course Aldershot was the largest concentration of our troops anywhere. And of course, that provided an opportunity to actually put on a field day exercise or a royal review perhaps 30,000 troops, including full regiments of cavalry, batteries of horse artillery, and columns and columns of red-coated infantry. It was a real spectacle. And of course, for visiting royalty, it was one of the must-do things on their visits to Britain.
Strangely, the only memorial to Prince Albert is that of his own making, the Prince Consort's Library.
He had a great interest in promoting officers' education in the army, and Aldershot had been established as a permanent military training camp as from 1854. So it was a natural thing that he should wish to establish a library of his own in Aldershot for use by officers of the British Army. From 1857, he was actively purchasing books on military strategy, tactics, military history, regimental history. These were books in French, German, and in English, and once he'd collected approximately 1,000 titles, at that point he asked the general officer commanding Aldershot to find him a site in Aldershot for his library. This particular one, it's nice and shiny because it has been rebound, but it has been rebound in the style of the original collection. It's called L'Art de la Guerre, The Art of War, written by Nicholas Machiavelli and published in Amsterdam in 1692. So it is written in Old French, but published in Holland in 1693. So the book was significantly old when Prince Albert bought it in the 1850s.
There are also first editions by the Queen herself.
This is one of her own called Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands.
Personally signed.
Presented to the Prince Consort's Military Library at Aldershot by Victoria R. Windsor Castle, March 1868. Two of the more valuable books in the library are these two. They're known as the clothing books, and there's one for uniforms of the infantry and one for uniforms of the cavalry. The infantry volume was published in 1768, and this is the only known copy in the world. The volume for the cavalry is even older. It was produced in 1742, and there's a cavalryman mounted on his charger. Quite superb plates.
Regrettably, perhaps the real reason there's no formal memorial to Prince Albert is due to the fact that on the last occasion he visited an exercise here, he got very cold and soaking wet. He returned to Windsor Castle feeling ill, and soon after he contracted and died of typhoid. No doubt Queen Victoria never really regarded Aldershot in quite the same way. However, Queen Victoria's association with this part of the country continued after Albert's death, but under completely different circumstances. The Queen became very good friends with a widow who lived in Farnborough, but she was no ordinary widow.
Napoleon III was Emperor of France, and he ruled France very successfully until a disastrous loss in a battle in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, when he was exiled to England, to Chislehurst in Kent. He was a Knight of the Garter, a very good friend of Queen Victoria. Because he was a Knight of the Garter, he was welcomed, given refuge in England, and he came with his wife, the Empress Eugenie, who was Spanish, and their young son, Louis, the Prince Imperial, who was their only son. The Emperor died in 1873, 3 years into exile. Their son, Louis, joined the British Army to try and keep his military, the family's military tradition alive. And he was killed when he was 23, fighting with the British against the Zulu in South Africa.
The Empress Eugenie moved from Kent and acquired this house, which is now the Farnborough Hill Public School. In so doing, she brought the small town into the realm of international politics, and for the next 40 years, it became the centre for visiting royalty and heads of state. the Empress would entertain Queen Victoria in the Red Parlour, and they spent a great deal of time together. As they were both widows, they found solace in each other's company.
Queen Victoria had a remarkably close relationship with the Empress. The historians say that the Empress Eugenie was the only person who could reduce Queen Victoria to incontrollable laughter, which is quite something when you think of the not amused reputation.
The handrail of the staircase is gouged with the deep furrows made by the Empress's heavy bracelets as she clasped it in her old age. It is said that at the age of 90 she fell down these stairs, but insisted on climbing them straight away. The library was originally her sitting room. From here, a huge window looks over the winter garden, which she built as a vantage point to look across to the Abbey. She built St Michael's Abbey as a mausoleum to her husband and son, and lies high up on a ridge in the grounds of the house. Only French workmen were used, as the Empress wanted to recreate her own corner of France, for she felt she would never return to her homeland. It is said that this, one of the most extraordinary pieces of architecture in this country, is a small corner of England that is forever France.
The crypt of St Michael's Abbey is full of echoes of Napoleon Bonaparte's tomb at Les Invalides in Paris. The one here contains 3 tombs: to Napoleon III, the Emperor, his son, Louis, and his Empress, Eugenie.
The tomb echoes Bonaparte's so accurately because they thought there might be a time when the French people would want Napoleon III to return to Paris. But it was not to be. Instead, the tomb is surrounded by a genuine piece of France. The monks here are part of an order based on the banks of the Loire.
Whenever she was asked about death herself, she always said, "I died in 79. In other words, when the prince died, she felt that she died. She lived 50 years in exile from 1870 and the Franco-Prussian War up till 1920. She was well into her 90s when she died. And a very strong character in the Farnborough area. Farnborough was very small, and Farnborough Hill was very big, and the Abbey was very big. And of course, with a community of French monks, as well as a French empress and the remnants of the French court, there was a very, very strong French contingent.
If it wasn't for the continued presence of Father Cuthbert's monks, that connection with France would almost be forgotten. Now Farnborough is best known for its association with the Royal Air Force and the Air Show, in its way a descendant of those great reviews initiated by Prince Albert.
While the practice of holding army reviews at Aldershot were discontinued after the death of King George V, I remember coming here in 1971 and sitting on the top of a hill like this one where my parents reviewed the household troops. And while the dress, equipment and manoeuvres were modern, the style of the exercise was similar to that which Queen Victoria would have seen in the year of her Golden Jubilee in 1887.
It's just one legacy of the relationship between the Crown and this part of the country. The River Medway flows into the Thames estuary from the county of Kent. At its mouth are 2 towns, Rochester and Chatham, which have developed for entirely different but related reasons. Chatham was one of England's most prolific dockyards, building and maintaining ships for the Royal Navy since the time of Elizabeth I, thereby thriving from the natural resource of the river. Rochester was responsible defending this bridge across the Medway, one of the most important crossing points on the road to London. Watling Street has been since Roman times the main route from the continent via Dover to London and beyond. So between them, Rochester and Chatham have been vital to both the Crown and the country.
Rochester has several unique links with the Crown. In particular, it played a key role in the story of the first abdication of a British king.
It's difficult to imagine today what the interior of this place might have been like in 1688. But what is now Lloyd's Bank in the High Street of Rochester was once the house where James II fled from London when his daughter Mary and son-in-law William, Prince of Orange, were invited to take the throne by Parliament. James II was Roman Catholic and was causing increasing concern by promoting Catholics to prominent government positions. His views were no longer tolerated, and Prince William of Orange arrived in England to safeguard the Protestants' interests. James panicked and fled along the Thames, dropping the Great Seal of England into the river in a futile attempt to make his usurper's life more difficult. James stayed here in Rochester for 4 days, during which time he wrote a letter stating the reasons why he was abdicating. He then left the house through the back garden to the River Medway and proceeded down the river and out to the French coast, never to return. The bank is now known as Abdication House, but in 1688 it belonged to a local dignitary, Richard Head, whose coat of arms was a black unicorn head erased. It's somewhat ironic that his colloquial address was the sign of the Black Horse. Rochester and Chatham's histories revolve around some exceptional buildings like Abdication House, as well as some significant characters. Perhaps the most extraordinary is Gundulf. He was a monk who sailed across the Channel as part of William, Duke of Normandy's invasion force in 1066. However, his real talent was being the foremost military architect of the day. When William the Conqueror selected London as his capital, he encircled it with forts. Gundulf was given the task of constructing some of the key castles, including the Tower of London and the fort here at Rochester.
The castle is on the site of a Roman fort, which was built to defend the bridge. Because of its position on the main road between London and Dover, it frequently came under attack.
The castle has seen action on a number of occasions. I think the most famous of all must be the Great Siege under the reign of King John in 1215. And it was actually conducted in person by the king himself, which is a pretty unusual situation.
The king clearly saw Rochester as a key site in his campaign against the barons. But try as he might, the castle would not fall. So he instructed his men to dig a tunnel beneath the foundations of one of the towers.
King John sent for 40 fat pigs of the type not suitable for eating to be rendered down into fat, with which they coated faggots which they placed alongside the pit props in the tunnel to aid combustion. And this fired the props, brought the props down and the tower above it.
The barons retreated further into the keep, but eventually surrendered due to lack of food and the terrible stench. King John was not, it seems, a merciful man. Although only one man was hanged, some of the others had their hands and feet amputated, whilst the rest were imprisoned in various royal castles.
Legend has it that the castle is haunted. During the 13th century, it was the home of Lady Blanche de Warenne and her betrothed, Ralph de Cappo. The story goes that her rejected suitor, Gilbert de Clare, in a fit of jealousy, disguised himself as de Cappo and managed to get into the castle.
He then chased Lady Blanche up the corkscrew stairways. Eventually, her cries for help were heard by de Cappo, who came to her rescue. He shot at the intruder, but the arrow was deflected from de Clare's armour and pierced the heart of Lady Blanche. Her tragic ghost is said to still haunt the castle to this day. The castle has dominated the Rochester skyline, along with the cathedral, for the last 800 years. Gundulf was also responsible for building the present cathedral. He was later to be appointed Bishop of Rochester, in charge of the most important cathedral of its day, second only to Canterbury. The King's Palace, which was within the walls of the monastery, was also the work of Gundulf, and said to have been the first place that Henry VIII set eyes on Anne of Cleves on New Year's Day, 1540.
Thomas Cromwell advised Henry to send an envoy to the Duke of Cleves in Germany to report on whether or not his daughter Anne would make a suitable wife for the king.
The envoys reported that Anne was tall and stately, and produced a painting by Holbein which was very flattering. A marriage was arranged, and after Anne arrived at Dover, she was brought to Rochester. However, her appearance in the flesh was rather different to how she'd been portrayed. Anne was variously described as being large and coarse, having irregular features, an ungraceful manner, and an ill-proportioned figure.
There are various stories about what happened next, and about Henry's reactions when he first saw her. One even suggests that he was so disappointed that he packed his bags and went straight back to London, taking his engagement presents with him.
Nevertheless, Henry was obliged to continue with the wedding, and duly married Anne on January the 6th, 1540, but was divorced within 6 months. Henry's daughter Elizabeth visited Rochester on several occasions while Queen, and it was this house belonging to Richard Watt that took its name, Satis House, from one such visit. Watt was an MP for the city during the 16th century and the surveyor for Elizabeth. At the end of her stay here, the Queen remarked rather ungraciously that the hospitality was satis, which is Latin for sufficient. Watt also established a local charity to house 6 poor travellers for 1 night each. The dissolution of the monasteries had put the responsibility of the poor onto the layman and away from the church. Charities like Richard Watt's grew up around the country, and the charity still runs today.
It was Henry VIII who decided to use the broad creeks and rock-free haven of the Medway as winter anchorage for his fleet, and he set up the warehouses at Gillingham Reach. Elizabeth I saw the need for a truly permanent navy, and in 1570 established the 4.5-acre site at Chatham, and from this moment it played a crucial role in the support of the Royal Navy.
To begin with, the reputation of the ports needed some improvement. Chatham, Rochester and Gillingham became known as Cheetham, Robham and Grabham. Britain depended on the royal dockyards to design, build and repair the ships of the fleet, but with the pressure on to fulfil this demand, corners were sometimes cut and corruption led to eventual disaster at Chatham Dockyard.
There is one particular family with a very close association with the docks, the Petts. This family were largely responsible throughout the 17th century for the designing and building of the ships.
They were highly influential in the Royal and Merchant Navies at Woolwich, Greenwich and Deptford, as well as dominating the Chatham docks.
They were master shipwrights. They built the finest ships. They built them well, and they outlasted other nation ships. The Pett family had their models of how they thought a ship would be, and they would take it to King Charles and say, this is how we think a warship should look. He would give it the royal approval, and the ship was built. And there were at one time 16 Peter Petts and 11 Phineas Petts. all Admiralty employed in dockyards, doing a variety of jobs. They ran the victualling, they ran the accounts of the Admiralty at one time. People knew they were corrupt. They were using naval stores for their own shipyards. They ran so many things, you had to get through several pets before you could get at the top man. And the top man was having lunch with King Charles anyway. So, it was not easy.
With nepotism and corruption rife, security became slack, incompetence spread, and the safety of the fleet was threatened.
This lesson was painfully learnt in 1667, when the Dutch sailed up the Medway, attacked and destroyed several warships. The Dutch raid is seen as one of the worst naval defeats in English history, and has been made infamous by the seeming incompetence of those involved.
Well, they knew that this was the fleet base. Also, of course, the only naval base of any size that we had on the east coast, facing Holland. And Holland was still then a major contender with ourselves for overseas possessions, empire, trade. And they knew it was a fleet base as opposed just to a building base. They could have sailed up the Thames if they'd wished and sacked Woolwich and Deptford, two major dockyards, but they were purely building yards. There was not much point. Whereas they knew there were numerous ships here, including the fleet flagship, and they were piloted up channel, burnt the ships which were guarding the booms, crashed the boom, parted it with no trouble, continued on to Fort Upner, where they terrorized the local population with their speed and ferocity of attacking the ships.
The raid was not just audacious. The Dutch only lost one ship. Times really haven't changed, and someone needed to be blamed, and a scapegoat was needed. It was Pett.
An inquiry by Samuel Pepys led to Pett's commission being removed, and he was taken to the Tower of London. Although members of the Pett family remained at Chatham Dockyard, they were never allowed the same degree of autonomy again. The present site of the dockyards extends over 80 acres and has over 100 buildings and structures. Most of the buildings which have survived were put up in the 18th century. Over 500 ships and submarines were launched from this dockyard, of which 125 ships were built and launched between 1700 and the end of the Napoleonic War in 1815. The most famous was Victory, Admiral Lord Nelson's flagship at the Battle of Trafalgar. She had been allowed to season for nearly 6 years, which made her one of the strongest and best formed vessels on the Medway. What remains of Chatham is the most complete Georgian dockyard in the world. Each building had a specific role. The ropery has made rope since 1618. Each ship required about 20 miles of rope for its rigging alone.
The sail and colour loft was built in 1723, primarily for sailmakers. It's this size because a large warship would carry over 4,000 square feet of sails.
The first flags at sea were used to denote nationality and were known as colours. Signal flags were introduced in the 18th century and codes developed to prevent enemy vessels from reading the signals. Nelson's famous signal prior to the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, "England expects every man will do his duty," was sent by signalling flags made here. The Commissioner's House is the oldest naval building in England. It's on the site of a previous house built in 1640 for the first resident commissioner, Phineas Pett. The beautifully painted ceiling above the main staircase was originally in the great cabin of the Royal Sovereign, the most important vessel in the fleet. Next to the Commissioner's House is the Cashier's Office, and this is where the pay clerks and staff were housed. John Dickens, father of Charles, worked here as a pay clerk from 1817 to 1822. Charles would have spent much time here as a boy, and his experiences are written about in his essays, The Uncommercial Traveller. As a boy, Charles Dickens would go for long walks with his father. On many occasions he would pass this house, and on one occasion he told his father that someday it would be where his family would live. Sure enough, Gad's Hill near Higham is where Charles Dickens made his home on the 14th of March, 1856. There is a bell on the roof which is rung whenever a member of the Dickens family visits the house. A horseshoe hangs upside down in the hallway of the house, just where he nailed it. It was put there to shower luck on all those who visited.
The house was full of famous people. Dickens loved to entertain, and all of his literary cronies came down here and spent long weekends, whether Dickens was here or not. Probably the most famous or infamous was the visit of Hans Christian Andersen, whom Dickens admired a great deal as an author. They had very similar backgrounds and had made their fame in a very similar manner, so Dickens admired him a great deal and invited him to stay at Gad's. Unfortunately, Hans Andersen didn't actually speak any English. All the correspondence that had been between them had gone through an interpreter, which Dickens hadn't realised. So Andersen came here. Dickens was off in London doing some performing. So Andersen was left to the mercy of the rest of the Dickens family, who didn't like him at all. Mainly because on the very first morning of his stay, he sat down and insisted that the sons gathered round him and shaved him. He said, "Shave me now," and insisted on that every morning, at which point they just put him in a carriage and sent him down to Rochester to have it done. And when Dickens came back, Andersen said, "I'm not feeling terribly welcome. Are you sure it's all right for me to stay?" And Dickens sort of said, "Yes, of course, delighted to have you here. Real pleasure." The subtleties of the English language were totally lost on Andersen, so he did stay, and stayed, and stayed, and stayed, for about 5 weeks, I think. Ludicrous amount of time. And when he finally went, when they finally got rid of him, the whole family had been driven to distraction. Dickens ran upstairs and put a placard over Andersen's bed saying, "Hans Andersen slept in this bed for what seemed like ages." And they never met again.
Considering his reputation as an author, surprisingly, Dickens' first love seems to have been as a performer.
He set up what really amounted to an amateur theatrical company, but one that was made up of the top people of the time. Artists, actors, other writers, and they became so impressive and so renowned that Queen Victoria rather wanted to witness one of the performances. So she invited the entire troupe to Buckingham Palace to perform for her. And Dickens, with all humility, refused. His daughters were involved in the cast, and of course in the Victorian era an actress was not one of the most socially acceptable things to be, and he didn't want his daughters to appear before the Queen under these circumstances, so he said, "No, I won't come." But we will perform on neutral territory, if you like. So the play was performed for the Queen, and she witnessed it, and she was ever so impressed. And at the end of the performance, she sent a message backstage that she'd like to meet Charles Dickens and to thank him personally. Dickens, who was still in his costume, again refused. He wouldn't meet her. He said, I can't appear in my costume. She'd just seen it on the stage, for heaven's sake. I see what the problem was, but he was ever so stubborn and wouldn't. And the Queen left. I mean, Dickens won that day. And then later on, when he started doing his readings, the Queen thought, Dickens is much older now, he can't be quite as precocious, quite as arrogant, So she invited him again to Buckingham Palace to give her a reading. And again he refused. And he said, "I do not perform for mere individuals. If you wish to witness a reading, you must become part of a more general audience." They did meet in the end, just before his death. The Queen invited him to Buckingham Palace, and he granted her an audience. But quite extraordinary, the arrogance and precociousness of the man.
The chalet was a present from an actor called Charles Fechter, with whom Dickens had worked. And Dickens didn't know it was coming. And one day, the poor old porter from Higham Station, which is a good mile down a very steep hill, popped up and said, we've got some packages for you. I'm not expecting any packages. And when they were brought up, it turned out there were, I think, 53 different boxes containing 90-odd bits of wood. And it was a chalet that they had to build, and of course nobody knew how to do it. And they did a big jigsaw puzzle, and they just built this thing and worked out how to do it. Whether it's supposed to look like it does now, who knows? It might be the other way up, I don't know. But that's how it came to be. He used the chalet for his writing. He built it in an area across the road from Gad's Hill called the Wilderness, which is an open grass area among the trees. And he worked in the upper story of the chalet. Windows all the way around. He had a lot of mirrors put in, 5 mirrors put in. And when he worked, he would throw open all the windows, and the mirrors would reflect the light. The butterflies, the birds would fly in. There would be the reflections of the trees and the flowers in all of the mirrors. He loved to work as part of nature. I suppose he got some inspiration from it, maybe. And his desk in the study here was in the bay window looking out into the gardens.
Dickens asked to be buried in Rochester, but his body was taken to Westminster Abbey. His spirit is said to walk the streets and local graveyards. On the day before his death, he was seen staring through the gates of this house. He had used it as inspiration for Miss Havisham's house in Great Expectations, but it is known today as Restoration House, for it was here that Charles II stayed on his return to London from exile in France in 1660.
As both Chatham and Rochester have been involved in the defence of the realm, each has played a key role in the story of Crown and Country. However, Rochester is rather unique, for it has witnessed the abdication of one king and the restoration of another. Since the days when William the Conqueror introduced the feudal system of land ownership to England, the Crown has governed through a number of trusted barons. In the early days, these individuals were granted huge tracts of land, and in some cases, these families and their estates still exist today. Throughout our island's history, these powerful landowners have played a key part in shaping the country as well as influencing the Crown. However, such power also brought its own problems and conflicts. One such family which has had a particularly turbulent relationship with both the Crown and the country is the Arundels. They may be the leading Roman Catholic family in the land and still celebrate Corpus Christi feast day and the Flower Festival, but the head of the family, the Duke of Norfolk, also holds one of the oldest hereditary titles in the kingdom, the Earl Marshal. The Flower Festival takes place each year in the Roman Catholic Cathedral of Arundel. Strictly speaking, Corpus Christi is Latin for Body of Christ, and during the festival his body is recreated in the form of bread and carried in procession to the accompaniment of hymns and prayers. In the old days, it was customary to strew flowers in the path of an important person as a mark of respect or reverence. The church adopted this practice to honour the Blessed Sacrament, which was carried in procession in the festival of Corpus Christi. In some places in Europe, the practice was extended so that all the streets of the town were covered in flowers. It's thought that this special celebration of Mass, or Eucharist, which takes place on the Thursday after Trinity Sunday, was introduced into the church's calendar in 1264. It was probably introduced to England by the 13th Earl of Arundel, whose shrine is contained within this cathedral, St. Philip. Philip was born during the reign of Mary I and was christened in her presence amidst much pomp and ceremony in the Chapel Royal at Whitehall. By the time Philip inherited the title and became the 13th Earl of Arundel in 1580, England had in Elizabeth I an Anglican and Protestant queen. For many years he struggled with his faith. He had been baptised a Roman Catholic, but brought up and educated at Cambridge as an Anglican. He tried at first to keep his allegiance concealed, but it soon became known. When he wrote to Cardinal Allen in France asking how he could best serve the Catholic cause, the letter was intercepted by the agents of Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spy master. They sent him a fictitious reply, advising him to flee to the continent. Arrangements were made for his departure from Littlehampton, the port at the mouth of the Arun. Once in the open sea, his ship was stopped by a warship and the Earl was arrested. It was an offence to leave the country without permission of the Queen. He was taken to London and imprisoned in the Tower in 1585. 12 months later, Philip appeared before the Star Court and was found guilty of leaving the realm without permission of the Queen and reconciling to the Church of Rome. As treason was not alleged, he was simply fined £10,000 and remained in prison. He spent 2 years in solitary confinement, during which time he made several engravings on the wall, which can still be seen. In 1589, Philip was again put on trial, this time for treason. The principal charge was that he had adopted the Catholic faith and had offered prayers for the success of the Spanish Armada. He was found guilty and condemned to death. There was general revulsion against his sentence. How could someone be condemned a traitor simply for praying? Queen Elizabeth decided not to sign his death warrant, but Philip was not informed, and so lived for 6 years in the Tower, thinking that each day might be his last. He petitioned the Queen to let him see his wife and the son he had yet to meet. The Queen replied that if only he would attend one Anglican service, she would free him and return all his lands and power. It was an offer he simply could not accept. After 10 years of imprisonment in the Tower, he contracted dysentery and died without ever seeing his son. During the following years, conditions for Catholics got easier, but the memory of those who fought so ardently for the faith remained. In 1970, he was canonised by Pope Paul VI as one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales, and he is now the patron saint of the Diocese of Arundel and Brighton. The Castle of Arundel has been the traditional home of the Arundel family since the earldom was created in 1067. In fact, it is the oldest in England. 1 year after his conquest, William I held his court at Gloucester. It was here that the new king rewarded his most loyal supporters, and this included Roger de Montgomery. Montgomery was left behind in Normandy to protect William's dukedom and to ensure that nothing untoward happened to the country while the ruler was away. As a reward for his services, Roger was given substantial amounts of land in Shropshire, the Welsh Marches, and a third of the county of Sussex. In return for these landholdings, Montgomery was obliged to build and maintain a chain of castles for coastal defence. These feudal forts were Dover and Hastings in Kent, Carisbrooke on the Isle of Wight, Pevensey, Lewes, Bramber, and of course Arundel in Sussex.
Roger de Montgomery was a good man, and he had 2 sons. One of them was rather a weak-willed man and decided to fall out with his king, which was rather stupid. And he was banished, and so all the honours and possessions of Arundel reverted back to the crown. And then, on Henry I's death, he bequeathed Arundel and its honours to his widowed queen, that was Adeliza. And she didn't wait too long to take a second husband. She took a very puffed up with pride gentleman called William d'Albini from Norfolk. And William decided that the wooden palisade and structure which used to be outside was not good enough for he and his ex-queen. So he built a stone keep, which would have had a residential house inside it, and 2 baileys, the Upper Bailey and the Lower Bailey. And these, of course, surrounded by stables, garrisons, and so on. So it's quite a large complex, covers about 5.5 acres, and hasn't actually changed in shape since that day.
During Adeliza's time in the mid-12th century, the inside of the keep would have been luxurious by the standards of the day. She and D'Albini died, though, without heir, and so the castle reverted to the crown. The chapel was founded by the 4th Earl. The nave and transept was a parish church for the townspeople of Arundel. The chancel was separated by an iron grille and used as a chantry, although it is now known as the Fitzallen Chapel. The new chapel formed the setting for a splendid daily liturgy with a choir of boys and men, and for the next century Arundel was noted for its music and Gregorian chants.
The church is unique, for after the Reformation, while the chapel remained Roman, the parish church became Anglican, and it's the only church in the land to serve 2 denominations.
The Arundels are not the only powerful family in these parts with a lengthy history. Nearby, Petworth House boasts a most intriguing pedigree of owners.
It was built by the Percy family, who, as the Dukes of Northumberland, are one of the most powerful in the country. As such, they all too often came to blows with the crown, and they too had complications when it came to religion.
The 9th Earl of Northumberland became known as the Wizard Earl because of his fascination with alchemy, yet it was his support of the Roman Church that led him to being suspected of treason.
James I suspected him of being involved in the gunpowder plot in 1605. Unfortunately, he wasn't involved at all. He'd just happened to be dining with his cousin Thomas Percy the night before, and Thomas Percy was very definitely involved in the gunpowder plot. But I think James I saw it as an opportunity to lock away one of the troublesome Percys so they didn't create any more disturbances up in Northumberland. And so he was locked away in the Tower for 16 years for really not doing anything at all.
Petworth House has changed hands many times. In the mid-18th century, the house came to the Wyndham family, the Lords Egremont, and it's descendants of this family that still own it today. It has the best collection of paintings and sculpture owned by the National Trust, and was called by Constable the House of Art. The collection consists of some 300 paintings, including works by Turner, Van Dyck and Gainsborough. The real contributors to the house were the Wyndhams, and in particular the 3rd Earl of Egremont.
He was a bit of a philanthropist, a very generous, benevolent landlord. The house was just a very free and easy place to come, and he was very interested in having colonies of artists and supporting their work. So there are always people working here, artists, sculptors, all sorts of people here, just a hive of activity, really.
Egremont was a patron of Turner. J.M. Turner is probably the best known of British Victorian artists.
He had a great admiration for Turner's work, and Turner actually stayed here, lived here for a while, and painted here. The 3rd Earl was really one of his greatest patrons.
On the day of the Earl's death, Turner drew a black hand in the visitor's book and led the mourners in the funeral procession. He painted 2 pictures in tribute to the Earl and never visited Petworth again.
He was a very interesting man. We know that, for instance, he vaccinated the entire town against smallpox. But he was also a bit of a womanizer, I'm afraid. He had many, many mistresses during his life. And he eventually married one of them. Elizabeth Iliff was really his common law wife. She lived here and was called Mrs. Wyndham, even though she wasn't, and bore him several illegitimate children. They finally decided to get married. And it only lasted a couple of years, unfortunately, after that, because he just wouldn't stop his philandering ways, and she couldn't put up with it and so left. But apparently he had 43 illegitimate children, and they all lived in the house at one point or another with their mothers. So the house was just constantly full of women and children and artists and just anyone, really, who wanted to drop in. So it was a constant hive of activity in this place.
This painting of Charles I's children was probably done at the time when they were staying at Osbourne House, just outside London, when they would be looked after by the Northumberlands. This was a tricky period, when families had to tread a careful line between not just choosing which faith, but now between choosing whether to support the Crown or Parliament.
The 6th Duke made his contribution to the works of art in the house by commissioning what is known as the Beauty Room, as a tribute to Queen Anne and the ladies of her court.
There's a row at the top of portraits of beauties, the ladies of Queen Anne's court, and underneath is what we call the Bonaparte scheme, which the 3rd Earl had installed in the room. It was very fashionable for one time to have the Bonaparte scheme. And it's the portrait of Bonaparte, and underneath that a bust of Wellington by Chantry, and then either side 2 Napoleonic battle scenes by Jones. It appears that originally the Beauty Room just had full-length portraits of the ladies hung in there. And the 3rd Earl was desperate to create this Bonaparte scheme, and so he was looking for space to do it and was stood with Chantry in the Beauty Room looking around, and they decided there really wasn't enough room. And so the 3rd Earl said, well, just cut off their legs. I'm really not interested in their petticoats. And fortunately, they didn't just cut off their legs. They actually folded the legs up the back of the paintings and then shifted all the paintings up the wall. So there actually was room then underneath to display the Joneses and the Phillips portrait of Bonaparte.
When the Civil War broke out in 1642, great families like the Percys and the Arundels, as well as their houses, became embroiled in the struggle for power. However, the reverberations were felt just as keenly by other families, like the Bishops, who lived at Parham.
Edward Bishop was the governor of Arundel. When the Arundel family made themselves scarce during the Civil War, Bishop, a royalist, was directly in the firing line of the parliamentary forces, but somehow managed to get away with it. Edward's older brother, Henry Bishop, was born at Parham in 1604, and he inherited the house and other properties after the death of his father when he was a young boy. During the Civil War, Bishop was a staunch royalist, and when a raid took place in Sussex by the parliamentarian forces, he fled to the parsonage in the village of Henfield. Henry was more vulnerable than most because his brother had, as governor of the castle, defended it against Captain Waller. Henry hid in a secret cupboard behind the bedroom panelling. He took his faithful dog with him and hoped that he wouldn't bark and give the game away. The Roundhead troops stormed the house, but the dog remained silent and Henry was safe. He then fled to Bristol before taking a ship to Virginia, where he stayed for 2 years. With the Restoration, he returned and was made Postmaster General as a reward for his services to the King. As with many other postmasters, he was constantly being accused of delaying letters, And so he introduced the bishop mark, which proved the time and date of the letter's arrival at the post office. This system is still being used today. Henry lived to the ripe old age of 88 and spent most of his remaining years in the parsonage at Henfield. Soon after he died, instruction was given to pull down the front of the house. Richard Woolven was the mason employed to do the job. A previous owner of the house had been renowned as a miser and to keep some of his fortune in a red crock in one of the secret chambers. During the demolition work, Woolven discovered the crock, but said nothing about it and disappeared off to London. He returned to Henfield with unexplained wealth, bought some land in the area, and lived the rest of his life in comfort. Henfield has one other house with an interesting story behind it. It's called Pendrell's, and is named after one man who helped Charles II in his escape to the safety of France. On the king's return, he rewarded Pendrell, who had risked his life for him. With the money, Pendrell was able to build this house. Between here and Shoreham is a village that was to be directly involved in the king's plight. After losing the Battle of Worcester, Charles was forced to make a perilous escape. He made for the south coast and descended the Downs into Bramber.
As Charles reached the bridge, he met a group of parliamentary soldiers out looking for food. It's said they actually jostled the future king and his escort as they passed, without realising who he was.
When the bridge was built here, the Great Bridge of Bramber, across the sea, which came right up to Steyning, they built a chapel on the bridge, at least the Normans built the chapel on the bridge, and called it St Mary's. And after a time, when the bridge became redundant, the name seemed to transfer itself to what was called the Chapel House.
It's not known exactly where he stayed while in Bramber, but the King's Room at St Mary's has been known as such for well over a century. Also, the game King's Escape has been played by generations of children.
The children seemed to develop a game called the King's Escape, in which they started off in the King's Room and went through the secret door that now seems to be in place, and down the stairs into the chapel under the hall, which is now blocked up. They apparently then went along a tunnel under the lawn and out by the Monk's Gate here, and escaped, and that was the way they said the king escaped. But I think they enjoyed it, and some of them remember it even today. Although they're grandparents now, they were children then and remembered the story.
Is the game still played today? Or?
No, it's
sadly not.
It's a part of history now.
During the Civil War and throughout the Commonwealth period, Arundel Castle remained unused and fell slowly into ruin.
Well, poor old Arundel Castle was left a mouldering pile of ruin. Many local peoples actually stripped all the sort of stonework away to use it for other places. And the Dukes of Norfolk temporarily lost interest in Arundel for a while. And then, really, the heyday came when the 10th Duke took over. And when he came, he drew out huge, great plans to completely rebuild the castle. Unfortunately, he and his architect died, leaving it to their son, also a Charles, who became the 11th. And he decided to start Arundel all over again, take down much of what was standing, and uniform it and bring it all up. Unfortunately, lots and lots of the ancient parts, I'm afraid, were sacrificed. There's only one part left, which is in the East Wing. It's the library. But all the rest of the castle was taken down to the bare bones and restarted. So within 100 years, this castle had been rebuilt twice, completely.
The work of converting the interior into a comfortable modern house as a setting for the large-scale entertaining expected in the early 19th century continued right up until the 11th Duke's death, only to be swept away by his successors. The 15th Duke replaced almost everything with a much more serious and scholarly architecture. The title of Duke of Norfolk also carries with it the hereditary position of Earl Marshal, one of the great medieval officers of the state. The original role was to marshal the earls and the troops during campaigns and before battle. Today the Earl Marshal has two principal roles: to supervise the College of Arms and to oversee the organisation of all the great state ceremonies, such as the opening of Parliament and the coronation service. It's thought that when Richard III created the first Duke of Norfolk, he linked it with the office of Earl Marshal, and the role has remained with the Dukes of Norfolk ever since.
The Dukes of Norfolk and the Earls of Arundel are by no means unique in the country. Over 900 years since the Norman invasion, there are still several families who can trace their inheritance and land back to the Domesday Survey. However, there are not many who, in spite of war, religion and breeding, are still fundamental to the affairs of the Crown and the country.
The magnificent spire of Salisbury Cathedral dominates the city and surrounding countryside, and no wonder. At over 400 feet, the cathedral was once the tallest building in the world. It was also a statement, built to demonstrate the power and wealth of the church. At its zenith, in the 15th century, Salisbury was the fourth largest city in England and the sixth richest.
Yet the story of how the city came to be here is a checkered one, and the Crown's many connections with this part of the country go back a very long way. This whole area is steeped in myth, legend and prehistoric mysteries, the most famous of which is Stonehenge.
Stonehenge is thought to date from anything between 4000 and 1000 BC. This is not the only stone or wooden circle in the area, but the awesome size of these stone blocks makes it unique. The blue stones were probably transported from Wales and erected by hand, and the Saracen stones from the Marlborough Plains. Such an awesome undertaking can't fail to impress, and even today makes us wonder.
Even a King of England spent a day here contemplating his future and the fate of his country. When on the run from Cromwell's army in 1651, the Prince of Wales paused here while waiting for a safe opportunity to slip out of the country so that one day he could return as King Charles II.
Settlements in those prehistoric times gradually became isolated forts, such as Old Sarum. Nobody knows why prehistoric man settled here. Salisbury Plain must have been a pretty inhospitable place even then. The Romans built a garrison, but even they didn't settle here in any numbers. It was Saxon times before the first large settlement was built here. That was at Wilton, which developed because of the trade routes. Wilton was on the key crossing over the Nadder and Wylye rivers and quickly grew as a commercial centre. Wilton claims not only to have given its name to the county of Wiltshire, but also to have been the ancient capital of Wessex.
Alfred encountered the Danes in 871 near here, and during the battle the town was burnt to the ground. But Wilton later became one of Alfred's fortified boroughs in his continuing campaign against the invaders. However, his successful pact with the Danes was shattered by Ethelred the Unready in 1002.
Unready quite literally means lacking common sense, which is still rather generous. Having failed in his attempt to buy out the Danish settlers, the king decided to murder them all. On St. Brice's Day, November the 13th, he arranged for one of the Danish settlements to be completely massacred. Not surprisingly, the Danes wanted revenge, and the following year practically destroyed Wessex, including Wilton. One result was the royal mint was moved from Wilton to Old Sarum, although the real blow to Wilton's fortunes came in 1244, when a new bridge was built over the River Avon, which completely changed the trade route. When the old nunnery, which had been founded by Alfred the Great, was dissolved by Henry VIII, the land was given to one Sir William Herbert. He was a Welshman who rose to prominence in the court through his marriage to Anne Parr, the sister of Henry's sixth wife, Catherine. Herbert then created Wilton House.
In 1544, Henry granted the abbey and the lands to William, and in 1551 he made him the first Earl of Pembroke. William went on, in fact, to become an executor of Henry's will, and also he went on to become a guardian of the young Edward VI. The second Earl married Mary Sidney, who was the sister of Sir Philip Sidney. She was an authoress, and also she was very interested in science, art and literature, a lady who was very ahead of her time. She became a great patroness of the arts, and in her time many important artistic visitors came to the house. For instance, Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare and his players, in fact, were reputed to have performed As You Like It here for the first time. Every family has its black sheep, and the seventh Earl is this one's black sheep. He committed murder in 1678, and he only escaped being committed to the Tower by pleading peer's privilege. Unfortunately, he committed murder again in 1680, and this time he managed to escape punishment by pleading the king's pardon, but only on the understanding that he would be banished to Wilton. It's said that he lived out his short and alcoholic life here at Wilton with, would you believe, 50 bull mastiffs, 30 greyhounds, some bears and 1 lion. So obviously during his time the house really fell to rack and ruin. It was also put into considerable debt.
The seventh Earl died without a successor, and it was left to his brother Thomas Herbert, the eighth Earl, to restore the name and fortune of the family, which he set about doing by collecting many artworks and beginning the famous Royal Wilton Carpet Factory. During the Middle Ages, the wool trade was extremely important in Wiltshire, but Wilton had only mediocre weaving skills. The Earl of Pembroke wanted to encourage the arts and crafts in the 1730s and 40s, and was convinced that the way ahead was through the encouragement of better technical skills. In France at the time, much to his annoyance, they had the state-of-the-art methods of weaving and were the envy of Europe.
Louis XV wanted to prevent any of his skilled craftsmen from working for anyone else, so he put a ban on them from leaving the country. But that didn't stop Pembroke, who smuggled 2 of the top weavers out of France by hiding them in wine barrels and shipping them to Wilton.
In 1742, the main Wilton weave was invented, a factory developed and a patent applied for, which also included furnishing fabrics. When fire destroyed the Axminster carpet factory down in Devon, Wilton took over the remains, looms and designs. They also bought the workers and with them developed the carpet, which made them famous around the world. Appropriately enough, all the carpets in Wilton House are Wilton's, although most are now copies of the originals. However, in the famous double cube room, which has been visited by virtually every monarch since Charles I, there is still an original Wilton carpet, which is nearly 200 years old. It still looks beautiful. Long before places like Wilton House were built, the Crown had its own lodgings in the vicinity of Salisbury. Clarendon Palace was originally a summer hunting lodge used by William the Conqueror and was possibly the only unfortified palace of the Norman kings. It was gradually transformed into a summer palace by Henry II and then Henry III, so that by 1189 Clarendon had been promoted to one of the major palaces of England. Sadly, there is only this flint wall left. But Clarendon has left its mark on history.
It's here that two great meetings take place that resulted in significant legislation and events of national significance. The first is 1164, which is the Constitutions of Clarendon. That was the first confrontation between Henry II and that turbulent priest Thomas Becket. Here they had their first confrontation over papal power, and some of the 19th century owners of Clarendon, Sir Frederick Harvey Bathurst in 1844, erected a tablet over there which claimed that Henry II, as the defender of the church in England against papal power as promoted by Becket, here at Clarendon sowed the first seeds which grew into the English Reformation of the 16th century.
The second major event at Clarendon also had long-lasting ramifications.
1166, the Assize of Clarendon. Here gives some impression of the scale. Here a parliament or a group of magnates meets and they set in train the Assize of Clarendon, which established for the first time the notion of trial by jury and jury representation in every ville and hamlet of the land.
Clarendon was not the only royal palace near Salisbury. The Normans built another palace which William the Conqueror used, along with a cathedral, in the ancient fortified town of Old Sarum. Its name comes from the Anglo-Saxon, meaning town of battle, and is most apt. This natural stronghold, probably fortified during the early Iron Age, was not only the scene of countless skirmishes between rival tribes seeking control, but also between the church and the crown.
The Inner Bailey was created in the reign of William the Conqueror, and he built, first of all, his castle and palace in the Inner Bailey, and when Bishop Osmond was elected by him to come to Sarum, the cathedral was actually started, and that's in the Outer Bailey. So the clergy were outside and the garrison and the king were actually inside. When Osmond was here, he was also Chancellor of all England. So at this point we have the clergy and the monarchy actually working hand in hand as a power base. And at this stage in the history of Sarum, we're pretty sure that really most of England was actually ruled from here and Clarendon Palace. It was probably one of the most important places.
At the same time as Osmond, a young priest called Roger became the steward of Prince Henry, the youngest son of William the Conqueror. When Henry was crowned in 1100, he made Roger his chancellor, and then the Bishop of Sarum.
Roger held enormous power and even represented the king when he was abroad. He also developed an efficient method of auditing the royal accounts by using counters on a checkered cloth, hence the name of the government department, the Exchequer. Such power brought distrust, and when Roger was suspected of supporting Matilda against King Stephen, he was arrested and forced to surrender all his property and riches.
Soon after, Bishop Roger died, and the castle and city began to fall into decline. To make matters worse, Henry II showed preference for the palace at Clarendon. Old Sarum was a bleak and windswept place. There were constant water shortages, and the clergy complained that the wind howled so loudly they couldn't hear themselves sing. In 1194, Bishop Richard Poore got permission from Richard I to build a new settlement in the valley below. There is a story that the new site was marked by the firing of an arrow from Old Sarum, and that where it landed was where they would build. Since the new site is some 2 miles away, it seems unlikely. Old Sarum, like Wilton and Clarendon, soon fell into decline. By 1377, there were only 10 poll tax payers, and by 1540, there was not one house standing.
However, Old Sarum survived amazingly as one of the most infamous rotten boroughs, returning 2 MPs, including the Prime Minister, William Pitt, in spite of the fact there were no voters. This anomaly was removed by the Reform Act in 1832.
With its new bridge built and the trade route established, Salisbury quickly prospered in its new location. It was at the heart of the cloth industry, and it produced a new class of wealthy citizens.
Just as Old Sarum had been important to the Crown, Salisbury now took on that role. And just about every monarch has visited the city in some time or another, although not always with the happiest of outcomes.
Richard III visited Salisbury with his kingdom in crisis. Foremost in his mind was the need to imprison his former ally, the Duke of Buckingham. The Duke is widely reputed to have been involved with Richard in the murders of the princes in the Tower. Now the king had to arrest his former co-conspirator with all haste. Firstly, the ambitious Buckingham had sided against him in the continuing Wars of the Roses, and secondly, Buckingham clearly knew far too much about the king's past.
Buckingham was captured and brought to Salisbury, where Richard III was staying. In spite of pleas for mercy, Richard ordered his execution, and in the courtyard of the Blue Boar just behind me, Buckingham was beheaded the following day. His severed head was carried through the streets of Salisbury to show the king.
It was the 2nd of November, All Souls' Day, and a Sunday. And it was very unusual for executions to take place on a Sunday. But I think Richard III was so frightened of this man that he just wanted him out of the way as quickly as possible. And of course, his ghost now haunts the site of the Blue Boar Inn, which of course is Debenhams. And the ghost is particularly active around November, December time, which is the anniversary of the execution.
Since the days of Henry VI, visiting royalty would stay here at Bishop's Palace. Situated within the cathedral's close, it was begun by Bishop Poore when he founded the city, and it reflects the power of the church at the time.
It is said that here in the antechapel, James II suffered his famous nosebleed. William of Orange had landed at Brixham in Devon, having been invited by Parliament to overthrow the Roman Catholic James. The king had arrived in Salisbury on his way to joining his army at Warminster, but he was unaware that some of his generals were plotting against him. Their plan was to invite the king to inspect his troops, seize him, and hand him over to the Dutch before any battle could take place.
On the morning King James was due to leave, the cathedral chaplain found some Catholic priests preparing to say Mass in the chapel. The chaplain was most perturbed and insisted the king ask the Catholics to leave. No sooner had the priests left than the king developed a terrible nosebleed.
As a result of the row over whether or not he could attend a Mass, the king felt it necessary to stay in bed for 3 days, in the room which is now used as the school sanatorium. In those 3 days, his generals changed sides and King James was isolated. He had no choice but to flee from here to Rochester and then into exile. Because of his nosebleed, at least the king managed to escape almost certain capture. Salisbury and the Cathedral Close was also involved in another royal escape, that of Charles II. The King Charles II room is named after the most notable visitor to Malmesbury House. This 13th century canonry was the setting in 1651 for the hasty planning of the future king's escape to France. This small priest's hole is where he could have hidden. The king was passed from one loyal household to another until he reached Hill House near Stonehenge, where plans had to be made for the final stage of the journey. He spent 6 nights here before riding to Shoreham, where he took the boat to France. He went to the house anonymously, but was instantly recognised by the lady of the house, a Mrs. Hyde, who suggested a plan to keep him safe, as she felt that none of the household that had seen him could be trusted. She instructed the king to ride off the next morning as if leaving, and then, under the cover of darkness, return to the house to hide until news came that his ship was ready. So the king and his aides set off and went as far as Stonehenge, where they stayed and looked upon the stones, spending the whole day there before returning to Hill House at the appointed time. The king then stayed alone in the hiding place for the next 5 days before setting off for the coast. "5 years after the monarchy was restored in 1660, the plague struck. Charles II left London to avoid the scourge of the disease. Remembering their help before, he brought the whole court to Salisbury and came to stay here at Malmesbury House. Malmesbury House lies within Salisbury's elaborate grid system, which was one part of the grand design by the founder of the city, Bishop Richard Poore. However, it is the cathedral for which Bishop Poore is best known. It is amongst the largest in the country, and with the exception of St Paul's in London, is the only one to be built almost entirely to the design of one man, with only the west front and the spire being added later. Henry III supported the project and gave as much timber as was necessary from the forests of Clarendon to build the roof of the cathedral. The cathedral's sheer dominance of the city of Salisbury and the surrounding countryside was meant as a statement, both of the wealth of the area and the power of the church. William Longespay was the illegitimate son of Henry II and Earl of Salisbury. Along with his wife, he was present at the laying of the foundation stone for the cathedral in 1220. A few years later, he was rumoured to be lost at sea, and his wife Ella, in his absence, was approached by a number of suitors for her hand in marriage. Most persistent of the suitors was one Hugh de Burgh.
Well, a few months later, William returned and there was great rejoicing. But of course Ella told him about the suitors, told him about Hugh de Burgh, and William was very angry and went to the king and complained. And the king said, well, no, you must settle this argument now. And Hugh de Burgh gave a great banquet up at Old Sarum for the safe return of William. And just a few days after the banquet, the very healthy William dropped down dead. Well, at the time, nobody seems to have been terribly suspicious, and they came and buried William down here in the east end of the cathedral, which had just been completed.
However, there was a rumour that the peace offering was in fact a poisoned chalice. There may be some truth in the tale, though, because when the architect Wyatt uncovered Longespay's tomb many centuries later, he found a dead rat in the skull, which had died of arsenic poisoning. The cathedral is rightly regarded as one of the most beautiful in the country. The spire is the tallest in England, rising 404 feet above the water meadows. And it was once the tallest building in the known world, and is still the highest surviving medieval spire in the country. There is something mesmerising about the cathedral and its spire. It's a construction so grand that it completely dominates its surroundings.
Whenever we see the magnificent spire of Salisbury Cathedral, like Stonehenge, we can't help but marvel at the skill and ingenuity of those who built them. Yet for all the wonderful stories of the Crown in this part of the country, in its way this extraordinary monument dwarfs them all.
On the route from London to Dover, known since Roman times as Watling Street, lies a great cathedral city.
Anyone travelling south through Kent and passing through this village of Harbledan would have caught their first sight of the cathedral from here. For most, it would have been a welcome sight. But for one king, however, it must have been anything but. Henry II was about to face the most humiliating experience of any monarch in the British Crown story, and to atone for one of the most notorious murders in history. Yet the death of Thomas Becket was to change the fortunes of Canterbury and this part of the country forever.
King Henry II had been in France when he heard of the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury and his former friend, Thomas Becket.
The king was horrified and immediately began extreme penitence, suffering 3 days solitary confinement, starvation, sackcloth and ashes. He then set sail for England across the Channel in a tremendous gale.
It was still pouring with rain when he reached Harbledan on July the 12th, 1174.
He came here and spent an hour or more kneeling here in prayer because he knew what it was going to be like once he set out from here. When he did, he went up the hill and down the other side to St Dunstan's, took his shoes off, and then walked barefoot into the city to the cathedral. And the crowds that were at the side of the road weren't exactly cheerful about him. They lost a very well-known archbishop, a loved archbishop, and they made it abundantly clear.
The king went straight to the northwest transept where Becket had been murdered and kissed the stone that he had fallen upon. He confessed his sins, declaring his innocence of the actual crime, but giving penitence for the hasty words which had encouraged the knights to undertake the fateful deed.
In the crypt were bishops and monks waiting for him, and here on his knees the King of England endured the scourging of the clerics. He then performed an all-night vigil, praying and fasting while propped up against one of the pillars.
He was whipped by the clergy. The bishops gave him a heck of a time. So he had a very sound treatment for his incautious words, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?"
Well, Henry II and Thomas Becket, of course, were good friends and well known to each other, and it was because of their friendship that Thomas Becket advanced so much from being a humble clerk, and he was appointed Chancellor. And then, of course, he was eventually made Archdeacon and then Archbishop. Henry thought that if he had Thomas as the Archbishop, he would be able to have some control over the church, which of course he hadn't got up until that time. So Thomas didn't agree with this, because obviously now he was ordained a priest and subsequently Archbishop of Canterbury. He wanted to be able to control his own church and not let the king have anything to do with it. So that was one of the reasons why they fell out. And Thomas Becket had been summoned to Northampton to meet King Henry II up there, and he realised his chances of survival were slightly slim, so he slipped away undercover as a monk and escaped.
The situation became so bad that Becket went to a monastery in France. While there, he continued to criticise the king, excommunicated important Englishmen, and even invoked the Pope's aid in support of his demands.
Just before returning to England in 1170, Becket enraged the king one last time. In a storm of anger and frustration, the king made his famous outburst. Four knights took him at his word and set out for Canterbury. When the king found out, he sent couriers to try to stop them, but it was too late. On the 29th of December at 3 in the afternoon, the knights forced their way into the Archbishop's hall unarmed. Their interview with him was fruitless and ended with raised voices. "You know where you can find me," Thomas shouted after them. The knights who had left their weapons in the garden armed themselves and tried to come back into the hall. It was locked, so they tried to smash their way in, and Becket was persuaded by his friends to go to the cathedral. With armed men all round, the only way in was by a little used door in the great cloister, but the door was locked, and the knights were getting closer. In the nick of time, a key was found, and the retainers dragged Becket into the cathedral, and the monks slammed and locked the door. Thomas wanted to confront the knights, but the monks hauled him unwillingly to the steps of the high altar. When the knights appeared with drawn swords, Becket broke loose from the monks and faced the intruders. De Morville, the leader of the knights, went through the routine of repeating their demands. Thomas went through the routine of refusing. This quickly developed into a shouting match and then a brawl. Swords were raised, a hand fell, and Becket slumped to the floor. The top of his scalp had been sliced off. The knights left him for dead and made off, yelling war cries.
All Christendom was appalled. The emotional reaction was tremendous. Becket was accounted a saint even before he was canonised in 1173. Yet this act of brutality was to change the fortunes of the cathedral and Canterbury forever.
While Canterbury Cathedral is now the acknowledged mother church of the Anglican Communion worldwide and is England's first cathedral, it was remarkably insignificant for its first 500 years. Towards the end of the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great sent Augustine and 40 monks to convert the English to Christianity. They established a large abbey on the outskirts of town.
The cathedral was first founded in 597, soon after the monks arrived, and the abbey was built very soon after because the monks needed a place for burial, because it was the tradition in Roman times to bury the dead outside city walls. So this was built from about 598 onwards.
Augustine's mission chose Kent as its base for two reasons. It was close to France, and more importantly, it was ruled by King Ethelbert, who was married to Queen Bertha, a Christian.
Queen Bertha was a French princess, brought up in the Loire Valley at Tours, and her conditions to marry King Ethelbert were that she could carry on practicing her Christianity. And so Ethelbert gave her what is now St Martin's Church. Queen Bertha, of course, carried on her Christianity, and the monks used that place as their first church, place of worship. Then, of course, they baptised about 10,000 people here in Canterbury, and they started to build their monastery in the cathedral on land given to them by King Ethelbert, which had been where his palace was, and on the site of the present cathedral.
William the Conqueror affirmed Canterbury's status as the senior cathedral before York or Winchester. Since then, the Archbishop of Canterbury has been the most important cleric in the country. In spite of its status, the cathedral remained relatively poor and distinctly unimpressive. The murder of Thomas Becket changed all that. Within months of his death, miracles and strange powers were alleged to exist at his tomb. Pilgrims came from all over Europe to worship at the shrine of St. Thomas.
The city soon became the #1 destination in Britain for pilgrims, who, like tourists, brought trade and wealth. They entered the city through the West Gate, but as there was a curfew at night, the gates were locked, so St Dunstan Street soon filled with inns and lodgings.
Soon after Becket's murder, one very important pilgrim to Canterbury was Louis VII, the King of France. He had a dream that he must pray at the shrine of Thomas Becket in order to cure his sick son. It was the first time in history that a King of France had set foot on English soil, and to mark the occasion, he gave a huge red ruby, known as the Regale of France. He placed this on the shrine and spent the night in prayer at the tomb. In the morning, the king was admitted into the membership of the cathedral monastery in the chapter house. In return, he promised to give the monks 100 measures of wine every year.
When Henry VIII had the shrine destroyed, the jewels encrusted on it, including the ruby, disappeared. There have been lots of rumours as to what happened. Some say you can see it on Henry's finger in a number of portraits. Others that it's hidden somewhere in Canterbury. Whatever, the ruby has never been seen since.
Of all the millions of pilgrims to Canterbury, perhaps the most celebrated is the Black Prince. The eldest son of Edward III had accompanied his father to the cathedral while still a child. The prince was a heroic and strong leader, his battle honours won during the 100 Years' War with France. He built 2 chapels in Canterbury and wanted to be buried here, even though the nation felt his status demanded a place at Westminster Abbey.
It's said the Black Prince died of exhaustion from the campaigns in France. His death was a national tragedy, his funeral a state occasion. Apart from being a legendary figure in our history, in honour of his achievements, part of the Black Prince's emblem, the 3 feathers, is still used by the Princes of Wales.
There were many famous characters at the Black Prince's funeral, including, ironically, the future Henry IV. He was only a child of 10 then, but not only was he destined to overthrow the son of the hero he was now mourning, but also be buried not so many years later at the same place.
Although the most famous landmark for pilgrims over the centuries has been the cathedral, there is another site which has also brought hundreds of pilgrims to Canterbury. It may not be so well known, but it holds a particularly grisly secret.
At St Dunstan's Church, on the outskirts of the town, there is a family vault belonging to the Ropers, who lived just outside the west gate of the city in Roper House. The name will not mean very much, but back in the 16th century, one Margaret Roper was the daughter of Sir Thomas More, one of Henry VIII's most famous chancellors.
Thomas More was a great friend of Henry, but King Henry claimed supremacy of the church, and Thomas More could not go along with this.
For him to have a king to be head of the church was a blasphemy that he couldn't bear. And because it was so much part of his inner nature, he had to stand out against it. What happened to Thomas was that he was jailed in the Tower of London, and then on the 6th of July 1535 he was taken to the scaffold and beheaded. He was his head then was parboiled and put on London Bridge on a spike. Now his beloved daughter Margaret couldn't bear this and bribed a boatman and also the bridge keeper, and she sailed under the bridge one night, and the bridge keeper threw down the head, and from that moment till the end of her death she kept the head with her. It was put into a large container with spices, and wherever she went the head went with her then. Eventually she died, of course, and the head was buried with her. And one of the Roper descendants organised the head and had it put in a grill in the wall, where it is to this day.
There is an even more gruesome tale, which makes the real-life story of the Ropers seem almost tame. The myth of Nell Cook is one of the Ingoldsby legends by Richard Barsham, although many believe it's firmly based on fact.
Nell Cook was a young servant girl of a friar at the Priory of St Saviour in Canterbury. He lived in a house by what is now known as the Dark Entry, a narrow passage leading into the cathedral's cloisters and crypt. He indulged in life, and particularly the pleasures, culinary and otherwise, of his young cook, Nell. One day, the friar told his household that he had been instructed to look after his niece. Nell, however, became rather jealous and began to suspect the friar. She spied on them and witnessed all sorts of unholy deeds. She felt so incensed by their relationship that one night, when the friar asked for a pie, she put poison in it. The next day, the friar and the niece were found dead together, and the cook had disappeared. It is thought that to keep the shame of the scandal from becoming known, the monks punished Nell by entombing her alive with a slice of her own pie. Legend has it that her ghost walks regularly every Friday night, and whoever sees her or feels the breath of her on their neck is doomed to die within the year.
The story stems from a poem about one of the scholars at the King's School. It's got nothing to do with the school's food, I'm glad to say, but about the dark entry between the cathedral and the school, through which the boy was terrified to walk. Given the length of time the school's been here and the history of the place, such fears are perhaps not surprising.
When St. Augustine came to Canterbury, he realised how necessary education was to maintain the church. His early efforts were centred around the abbey and the cathedral, where what is known as the King's School developed. Most of the beautiful historic buildings of the school still lie within the precincts of these two ancient places. It became known as the King's School after the intervention of Henry VIII. Like the other King's schools attached to cathedrals, their story is rather mixed, for it was their founder Henry VIII who was responsible for the dissolution of the monasteries and the destruction of nearly all the shrines in the country. Canterbury was no exception. Indeed, as Thomas Becket's was the most significant shrine, the king's agents took special care to destroy it all. Ironically, Every Sunday, the school uses a route to the cathedral, which the pilgrims would have travelled along to visit Becket's shrine. The Norman staircase is thought to be part of the original monastery and has been used by the school since the time of Henry VIII. After the dissolution, many of the monastic buildings found alternative uses. For instance, this room was kept for royal visitors. Indeed, Charles I spent his wedding night here. The school has educated many men of note, including the 16th century playwright Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe was the son of a shoemaker from Canterbury, born in the same year as Shakespeare, 1564.
He was exceptionally talented and gained scholarships to the King's School and then Cambridge University. It was here that more than likely he first came into contact with Sir Francis Walsingham, who was Chancellor. Walsingham used the university to enlist bright, patriotic young men to join his fledgling secret service.
When Marlowe had got his BA, when he was 20, he was obviously selected for this and sent to Reims, where there was a Catholic seminary, where a really dangerous plot was being hatched, called the Babington Plot, which was to assassinate Queen Elizabeth and her chief ministers and put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne as the Catholic Queen. And this was finally, just in the nick of time, discovered, and Marlowe was one of the people who was responsible for helping to uncover that. He has been shown as a sort of nasty character. He was not at all. He was the most wonderful, gentle, poetic, and very, very advanced thinking, courageous man.
There is a statue of Amused dedicated to his memory, which stands outside the theatre in Canterbury, which is named after him. On what was probably Marlowe's last visit to Canterbury, in September 1592, he had a violent disagreement with a tailor called William Corkin. Marlowe and Corkin were friends and had been choir boys together. While walking near the West Gate, an argument broke out between them, and the tailor assaulted Marlowe as he was probably not faring well in their war of words. After retreating home wounded, Marlowe decided to teach his friend a lesson. He returned to the spot with a staff and dagger, with the intention of giving Corkin a fright. It is thought that Marlowe used the dagger to cut off Corkin's buttons, which could hardly have been a greater insult to the tailor.
There is a document in the city archives which relates to the incident, but by the time the case came to court, the two had settled their quarrel and the case was dropped.
Earlier this century, a red rose was found in the plea book, which had been pressed between its pages sometime in the summer of 1592. It's thought that Marlowe had placed it here as a symbol of their renewed friendship. It was the gesture of a great poet and is still kept in a case in the cathedral library. Just outside the city is a gesture of a different sort. As part of Henry II's penance for the death of Becket, he endowed a leper hospital in Harbledown.
There would have been a little over 100 people here who were lepers principally in the early days, and possibly that's another reason he chose this church, because normally you kept away from lepers, and he would know that this was one place he could go where he wouldn't be interfered with.
Henry paused here at St Nicholas's Hospital before his descent into Canterbury, where he was to face the anger and the punishment of the people in the church. He took a couple of hours to reflect and pray on the ordeal he was about to undergo.
In the grounds of St Nicholas's is a well named after the Black Prince. It was believed that the water from the well could heal diseases of the blood. Both Edward III and the King of France were known to have visited the well, but it is thought that the Black Prince took the waters on his deathbed, which is why his feathers are on it now. The city still pays for the hospital today, and although it's a mere £13.33, it is always presented on behalf of King Henry. Tradition says that if the payment ceases, then it would jeopardise the king's soul. This unique link between the Crown and Canterbury is forever reflected in the city's coat of arms. While the motto beneath reads Ave Mater Anglia, Hail Mother of England, the actual insignia on the coat of arms incorporates both the royal lion and the three birds of Becket's arms.
Rarely do we find such a strong visual symbol of a particular episode in the Crown's relationship with a part of the country. Yet out of such a tragic incident, Canterbury has ultimately benefited.